South Africa has just finished the seventh elections in its democratic history, national and provincial elections, to much global attention as well. And we are here to speak with Gareth Newham, the head of the Justice and Violence Prevention Project at the Institute for Security Studies, one of our big partners in South Africa for the past 30 years. My name is Karin April. I'm a senior project officer at the Hans Seidel Foundation and head of the Johannesburg office. Gareth, thank you very much for joining us. So let me start with asking you these elections for context. If you could briefly share with our audience in what way these elections were different from previous ones, just in terms of voters' choices.
Thank you, Karin. These were different, firstly, in the sense that they're the most contested elections we've had since our first democratic elections in 1994. Since then, the African National Congress, which has been the governing party, has usually been assured of a large majority. But that started to change after Thabo Mbeki received almost 2/3, or the ANC received almost 2/3 of the votes in 2000 and back in 2004, and has slowly been losing support since then, every national election, every 5 years. But still, last year, the ANC still won with a comfortable majority of 57%. And what we saw in these elections is that the polls from early on started to show that the ANC was going to get far less than that. Towards as we got close to the elections, you started to see the sort of polls showing them doing better, but all polls showed that they were going to get less than 50%. And even though they started really getting into the campaign a bit late, only a few weeks before the election, and we could see that was making a difference, no one really expected them to get as low as they did. So that they received only 40% of the vote, no one really expected that to be the case. Most people thought they would get between 45%. Some still thought they might still make it to 50%. So that is something quite noticeable in this election. A second dynamic was that a whole lot of opposition parties came together under what was called the multi-party charter. So that was headed by this largest opposition political party, the Democratic Alliance, and they brought a number of other parties together over a period of time to contest as a group. And the idea was that if that they collectively got enough votes, they would then obviously form a coalition government. And then probably the third most important factor was the emergence of a new party under the former president, Jacob Zuma, called the MK Party, which is named after the former armed wing of the African National Congress during the liberation period, Umkhonto we Sizwe. And that party was only launched in December, midway through December, and already started picking up quite a lot of support in the polls. But they did much better than people expected. So those are three ways in which these elections are very different to all the elections we've had since we had our first democratic elections.
Thank you very much, Gareth. You already alluded to results now. So could you share with us a little bit more about the outcomes of the elections, both on national level and in the key provinces? So how did the ANC perform, and the biggest opposition party, the Democratic Alliance? What were the results for this new MK party of the former President Jacob Zuma that you spoke about? And where do you see the reasons for these outcomes?
Well, as I already mentioned, the ANC got just over 40% of the votes, so that was their worst performance, and which meant that they dropped by 17% in a 5-year period. So that was quite a big shock for them. The next biggest political party, the Democratic Alliance, which has been the official opposition for a number of years now, improved slightly on their previous elections in 2019, but not by much. They still get just below 22%, which is actually less than which they got 10 years ago. So they've kind of reached a ceiling in terms of their current support in South Africa. The big shift really was the Umkhonto we Sizwe party, the MK party, coming third with just over 14.5% of the national vote, which was a huge surprise. Followed by the Economic Freedom Fighters, the EFF, which up until now were the third largest party in parliament. They usually had about 10%. They've dropped to just over 9%, so they also were a bit of losers. And then we've got sort of, because they're not really big, they're only getting a few percent, but we're talking about the Inkatha Freedom Party, which was usually a traditional Zulu nationalist party, which has now been overtaken by Umkhonto Sizwe Party because they've been campaigning on a Zulu ethnic base. And the Patriotic Alliance is a newcomer. It's also seen as a kind of coloured nationalist party, very active mostly in the Western Cape, competing with the Democratic Alliance, and they managed to get 9 seats in Parliament. Altogether, 18 different political parties made it into Parliament. Most of those only getting about 1 or 2 seats. And that is out of 52 political parties that actually campaigned to try and get into National Assembly. The big stories about these elections at the provincial level was going to be, firstly, Gauteng, which is the most populous and economic active province in the country. It has the seat of the national executive in Pretoria, the capital. And that saw a big shift for the African National Congress. In the previous elections, they got just over 50%. In these elections, they only got 37%. The DA did pretty well. They got 27% coming in second. Followed by the EFF, which I think had around 18% or so, and then Umkhonto Sizwe, but they didn't do very well in the Gauteng province. So the Gauteng province could be governed by a new coalition that does not contain the African National Congress, depends on what happens at national level. The other province, which was going to be highly contested, was KwaZulu-Natal. That is also a province where the former president is very popular. And polls were showing that the ANC were going to really do quite badly there. The polls were actually showing them to be getting in the low 30s, or sometimes as low as 25%. But the outcome for the African National Congress in that province was they only got 18%, whereas the big shock was the MK party getting 44% of the vote. And now they're going to have to decide how they try and form an alliance there. Most of the other provinces, we saw the DA holding on to the Western Cape. And then most of the other provinces, save for one, the ANC still managed to get a majority and will be able to form provincial governments there. I think the Northern Cape was the one province where they just got below 50%, but they could get a one-seat party to help them with that. So we are now seeing a shift away from the ANC, which was dominating 8 of the 9 provinces. It's now much weaker in 3 of the most economically active provinces with most of the population, and have been more relegated to the rural provinces. So that's a shift in voter support. So people living in the big cities have tended to move away from the ANC into voting for other parties. The turnout was lower than the last elections. Last elections in 2019, we had a 66% turnout, which is quite good for South Africa. But this dropped down to, I think, about 57, 58%. So it does raise concerns that not enough people who could be voting are voting. So that's one of the dynamics we're also focusing on.
Thank you. So maybe just to add for viewers that are not so familiar with the South African system, that this voter turnout is based on those voters that had actually registered, of course. As we know, so the real turnout of all the people that would have been eligible to vote was actually in the region of 40% or possibly even slightly less, because many people didn't register to vote in the first place. Yeah. Right. Thank you for that. A brief word on how the elections were run by the Independent Electoral Commission. How efficient was it? How peaceful was it? And what is the perception of how well run these elections were?
Well, I think going into the elections, people were quite confident that the Electoral Commission would be able to run it. It's known to have run all the previous elections successfully. Not only the previous 7 national and provincial elections, but the local government elections which happen in between. And they also oversee all the by-elections that happen quite regularly every month. There's usually a by-election or 2 somewhere in the country. So they're known to do a good job. They're credible. There's no concerns there that they would try and manipulate the vote. We did, however, see the Umkhonto Sizwe Party quite early on coming out and starting to try and sow disinformation and confusion and making allegations that the Electoral Commission was not going to be fair and that it was getting involved in politics and was going to try and deny votes and vote rigging. And that seemed to be a strategy because the MK party didn't know how well, they'd never competed before, they didn't know how well they were going to do. They were making very outrageous claims that they would be getting 66% of the national vote, which everybody knew was not going to happen. None of the polls showed that at all. So I think they went in trying to discredit the Electoral Commission and hoping that would cause a little bit of confusion and give them some leeway to maybe negotiate something. Although they did much better than everybody expected, including themselves, I think, they still, the former president, who's the sort of front or the main face of the party, came out on Saturday and still said that there was large-scale vote rigging and fraud, but no evidence to that extent have been brought before the electoral courts or any of the kind of systems that are there to check that. Generally, we had thousands of observers. So first of all, every voting station has different observers from the different political parties. They not only watch the process, they also watch the counting, and they verify the results, which are then posted at the door of the voting station. People take photographs of it. They then send the boxes through to the national voting, or the provincial and national voting station counting areas. So it gets verified there, and there was no indication of any kind of widespread fraud or rigging whatsoever. So all of the electoral observations we had from we had South African regional community. They had from various countries around the region had sent observers. We had civil society with over 5,000 observers. No one reported any major irregularities. I think there were some glitches, logistics. Voting stations were supposed to open at 7 o'clock in the morning. In some instances, they only opened at 9 o'clock. They're supposed to close at 9 o'clock at night, but the queues in some places are very long, and they voted throughout the night. And what most of the concerns were just the long queues. And that usually happened when the electronic voting tablets that they were using to verify people, that they registered, and you had to vote in a station that you were registered. You couldn't just vote anywhere. Some of those went offline for some period of time. They ran out of ink to mark people's thumbs. They ran out of ballot papers. They ran out of ballot boxes. And so that caused a lot of concern for some people because they spent a lot of time in voting queues. I think most people in the cities found themselves waiting for a longer period than they are used to voting. So that was the only real issue, but it hadn't changed the results of the election. So I think overall, they've declared the results are final. This happened on Sunday evening at 6 o'clock. And there's been no real concern that there have been any problems with this election at all.
Thank you, Gareth. Now, just a brief note. Of course, some people were saying, how will the ANC react to a defeat? There was some apprehension about that as well. So just briefly, can you just spell out how do you read the ANC's reaction to these results? And also, what are the coalition options on national level that South Africa is now facing? And what would be the implications of those for the country?
Thanks. Yeah, the African National Congress has been very good in accepting defeat. There's always was that concern because they were so dominant that if they were to suddenly lose power or lose a majority, would that cause chaos or instability? But they did lose the Western Cape. They have lost in 2021. They lost a number of the big metros. So the African National Congress accepted the results. The president, Cyril Ramaphosa, came out and gave a speech when the results were announced, and he congratulated everybody for having peaceful elections and said this was the will of the people. There's been no one in the ANC that has said that the results are flawed or try to contest the findings and the outcomes. So I think it's very positive, and that has been because of the past. They've been losing sort of votes over time. In the last local government elections in 2021, they lost a number of all the big metros. So it's not the first time they've sort of seen their polling fortunes diminish. So that's very, very positive. This 40% means that they have to go into coalition with another party or another parties to push themselves above 50% to be able to form a government. And that, I think, is the big question. There's not really many options. The option that seems to be favored by a lot of people in the ANC that are part of the dominant who support the current president is to go with the formal opposition, the Democratic Alliance. That would be the most stable. It's the least radical, and that would be acceptable to 65 or just under 65% of the population who voted either for the ANC or the DA. So that would probably be the most likely outcome if all goes well according to this current the negotiations about a start and the various configurations to that. The other option that the ANC could consider is going with two other parties, such as the Economic Freedom Fighters, who got 9%, and then another party such as the Inkatha Freedom Party or the Patriotic Alliance. That would push them over 51%. It would be a coalition of then three political parties. That would probably be not so good for the country in terms of international investment, because the Economic Freedom Fighters are very radical. They want to see the full nationalization of the banks, the mines, the Reserve Bank, and they are very unreliable partners. So they've been in sort of coalition agreements or working with parties at the local level, but it's often been quite destabilizing. They don't always keep to their word. They're not a very reliable partner. The Patriotic Alliance, on the other hand, has also not been a very reliable partner at local government level, and this is their first foray into the national space as a political party. So again, an unknown entity at that level. So that would also probably be not great for the value of our currency and for trying to promote new investment in the country. The other possible option would be for the ANC to go into coalition with the MK Party, because the MK Party got 14% nationally, so they would obviously be over the top. But their condition for doing so would be that the president resigns. And also that party wants to do away with the constitution. It wants to reintroduce parliamentary supremacy that we had under apartheid and elevate the role of traditional leaders, monarchs pretty much, chiefs and kings and queens above parliament. So unelected people. So basically turn South Africa into a kind of monarchist type structure that doesn't have a constitution. And that, of course, would cause a lot of havoc with our economy, and we'd see a lot of capital flight. And again, our currency would suffer negatively. So those are really the only options on the table at the moment. At the national level, and of course, what happens there that will inform probably what happens at a provincial level. Because they would have to make deals both at a national level and at certainly Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal.
Being mindful of time, one follow-up question. What about a minority government? Some people now say, would the ANC possibly be able to have a minority government instead of choosing a coalition partner?
That would be possible, but also very risky. Because in order to pass the budget nationally, in order to get legislation through, you have to make sure that you get more than 50% of the votes. And so if you're trying to govern as a minority party without the knowledge that you could have that stability or certainty, would be, and we've seen this in the local government elections, where smaller parties suddenly leave an agreement and it plunges that city into a governance crisis. So I think that's something that could happen, but it might not be the best option. Another option is a government of national unity, where the ANC invites a number of the parties into government and offers them positions as cabinet ministers or deputy ministers, in order to have what we had initially after the end of apartheid, the birth of democracy, in order to try and get everybody into the system, have a government that's made up where different parties hold different positions, and so they all have investment in the government. Again, if you have too many of these different parties and they have come from very different ideological positions, it does make it very difficult to manage the cabinet and to have clear policy directors if you've got different departments pulling in different directions. So those are all possibilities, but I think from what we understand at the moment, the one that would be the sort of best for the country and in the long run would just be where you had two parties making an agreement. It doesn't necessarily mean, the DA isn't necessarily saying it wants government positions as ministers. Mm-hmm. They've already floated the idea that they would be happy not to be in the executive, but to, for example, control the Speaker of the House of Parliament and chair all the most important oversight committees, so that they could really strengthen the Parliament as an oversight mechanism, which it has been not being able to do because it's mostly been dominated by the ANC, which also dominates the executive. So that's another option. These are all options on the table, and we'll only really know in the next week or two which options are going to be the ones considered and agreed to.
Thank you very much. Last question. If you had to point to 3 areas that a new government should focus on, what do they be?
Well, given the work we do, we would say really focus on improving public safety. There needs to be wholesale reform of the South African Police Service. They really need to look at that organizational performance and capabilities. It has been deteriorating since 2012, actually. We've picked up the first indications then. And since that deterioration started, we've seen a big increase in the murder rate in South Africa. And the numbers of murders have gone up by 77% since murders started to increase in 2012. So that would be for us a critical area of priority, because until you get on top of the crime situation, as indicated by the murder rate, our most reliable crime statistic, it's very difficult to promote local economic development, social cohesion, solve a whole range of problems. I think the second would really be looking at growing the economy, just making sure that the economy grew in an inclusive way that was able to create jobs. And so that would be something that a new government would have to really put clear economic policies on the table related to promoting the transition away from coal-fired power stations into renewable energy sources, for example, making sure the logistics and transport networks were up and running properly so that the economy could really start to grow and create the jobs, because we have an incredibly high unemployment rate, which contributes to high levels of poverty and is a driver of crime itself in many respects. And then I think thirdly, it would probably have to be education. It's really to make sure that the young people in South Africa are given the skills and the capabilities to be able to enter the job market or to become entrepreneurial. Mm-hmm. Our education system isn't very functional either. A lot of people about half the people who start in the education system in the early years, grade 1, when you're 6, 7 years old, only half of those people actually finish the entire education process, and still then don't have very good rates of literacy, mathematical ability, and so forth. So I think with those, I would imagine a new government, if they really wanted to see a difference in the next 5 years, would really get to work quickly on trying to achieve improvements in those 3 key areas.
Thank you so much, Gareth. That was very insightful, and I think the country is sort of holding its breath at the moment. Quite happy that the elections ran the way they did, but everybody is now, of course, keen to see where will that take us and what does it mean for the future of South Africa. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate your analysis. Thank you.